Hey everyone, I hope you're well, playing on making the games that you all love. You're joining me, your host, Max Pears, but not just me. I'm joined by the energetic, highly entertaining colleague of mine, the good old Keano Raubun, who is a senior narrative designer. Keano, thank you very much for joining me, mate.
Hey, thank you for having me. Also, it's a beautiful intro.
Did I get the name
Beautiful
right?
intro.
I feel like I still
Yeah,
fucked up the
it's
name.
fine. It's fine. I'm like, oh, it's acceptable. It's acceptable.
I
I'll roll with
appreciate
it.
that, mate.
I've had, yeah.
Well, for those of you who don't know, Keanu is, like I said, senior narrative designer. We currently work together. You're a lot of fun to work with, mate. And I just wanted to get you on as well because I think you're not only great to work with, I think you got such an interesting mind and you can do so much, which I really respect. And yeah, I think just having the people that listen to the show understanding more about what a narrative designer is, how to get into that side of design, and just get your takes on it. So, do you want to explain a bit more about what narrative designers do in terms of that, mate?
But first, let's have a quick word from today's sponsor. Today's sponsor is none other than me. What I've done, everyone, and I hope you're excited for this, is I've actually created a level design kind of store. What I've done in this store is put up different kinds of tips and tricks that you can find there, whether that be my actual ebook itself to that of level design pamphlets focused on different things such as traversal, stealth, breaking into the industry, as well as different talks that I have done which you cannot find anywhere else other than on this store. So if you are looking to improve on your level design skills and processes, then check out the Level Design Store, which will be down in the description below, where there'll be a link to find this. All you need to do is head over to gumroad.com/level design lobby. I hope you like what you see, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you, and now back to the show.
Yeah, so narrative design is fun because there was recently discourse on Twitter, because there's always discourse on Twitter about sort of the definition of a narrative designer.
Yeah.
And it's basically, for me, it's sort of like someone who marriages gameplay and story and writing into sort of like a cohesive whole, right? Like, you have game designers who champion the game design, you have writers who write stuff, but in the middle you have your narrative designers who make sure that everything that everyone wants gets done and like feels like a cohesive whole and implemented properly. You're a champion of story, essentially.
I
And
like that.
you'll be involved with a lot of different departments. You have to be having a lot of
Mm.
conversation with directors, as I currently do. And yeah, you're balancing everyone's hopes and wishes, and you're trying to. And if you're like me, you always have someone saying that you need to cram in a lot more dialogue at certain points because people don't like noise, like silence in games these days.
Yeah, yeah. I was gonna say, how do you find that balance then in terms of, like you said, learning when to let the player sit with their thoughts versus adding in that extra element, and then obviously we've got audio playing their own role on top of that.
Yeah, it's a fun question because I most of the time I enjoy the bare bones approach. So just let people stew in whatever you're making at the time, right? Like a level designer won't be happy if you add another dialogue line or five about, oh, I guess I should do something here. There's a hint here. I have to do something.
Mm.
So balance, yeah, it's just start with sort of like bare bones to what I do, and then I build up if it's needed. I don't. I don't write to every possibility there is. I just try to sort of like you think about them and you identify them, but you're like, okay, well, let's cut it back. And most of the time, you're more likely to cut dialogue than write more.
Yeah, I say it's the main case, right? With anything, it's
Yeah, yeah.
normally better to put it on the
Put
chopping
more
board.
words in there. No, I can't. There's no room.
Oh man, and I wanted to ask then, like, how did you get into this role then, bud?
Oh yeah, that was a long journey because I started
Mm.
back at it was called NHTV Breda, which is in the Netherlands, which is currently called the Breda University of Applied Sciences, and I did a course of game design and production. I have a degree in it, so I came from a game design background.
Mm.
I specialized in narrative design. did an internship at Rage Quit on a little indie game called Action Hank, where I was a level designer.
Oh, wow.
They went up to make Descenders, so that was pretty fun to see how that turned up. And after college, which was from 2011 to 2015, I ended up searching for a job for a year and a half, just staying with my parents, working odd jobs while in my spare time, whatever time I had. I was working on my portfolio, applying to a lot of studios, and but yeah, like the thing that helped me a lot was modding for video games. I made a mod called Lorband, which is a big Skyrim expansion. There was a lot of narrative design going on there, so
wow,
a lot of content, a lot of trial and error.
I can imagine that, mate.
Yeah.
And for those, because like modding seems to be a less traveled route nowadays versus what it used to be back in like say the 90s, early 2000s. How did you get into? I mean, I know Skyrim has such a huge modding community, but how did you decide to go say that route for working on your portfolio, mate?
Yeah, it was okay. Oh yeah, it was part of my specialization project back in uni, and then me and some other designers decided, hey, let's just sort of like make a mod, and then that sort of like ended up in like a multi-year affair, where a lot of people hopped on and off the project, sort of like with the goal of getting portfolio fees and getting into the industry, which I think 90% of the people I ended up getting like jobs and being like senior level designers everywhere nowadays. So that's
amazing.
It wasn't released. I don't know if it's going to come out. I hope it does, because there's still like people working on it. But like in terms of like the original mission statement, which was getting people jobs, we were pretty successful in that regard, which I'm pretty proud of.
No, it's amazing. And I know like a lot of the schools out in the Netherlands do produce some incredible developers out there.
Oh yeah.
Mate. So
like the level nowadays is even higher than like when I started, because it's so much easier to make games nowadays.
Yeah.
Like you said, like modding isn't the number one avenue, right? Because right now everyone's like they're learning Blender, they're hopping onto Unity or Godot or Unreal, because there's so many resources available right now. It's way easier to just make a game, especially with game jams and YouTubers sort of like pushing that aspect of game development. Yeah, modding is becoming sort of like, unfortunately, less popular. But I wouldn't say dying breed, because it's not, but less renowned.
Yeah, I was thinking there's not as many games like encouraging modding with tool sets, right, compared to what it used to be, because it must take so much time and effort to make those modding kits, right, like tools.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, man. So yeah, like you said, you started in level design. When did you know you wanted to transition into that of more narrative, mate, or is it always something you knew?
Yeah, it's always been. I've always been like into storytelling. I drew like comic books of video game characters back when I was in grade school, even Mega Man Sprite comics and stuff. So I think that was always sort of like a given. Also, like RPG Maker XP, that was also a throwback, early 2000s.
Yeah.
I always fancied myself sort of like a generalist, so multi-didact in terms of making games. So yeah, I just want to know everything, want to do everything myself, and I think that was also my strength professionally, is that I was sort of the most technical narrative designer on the project I've worked for. So if someone wanted it, I could just make it. There wasn't like 2 or 3, 4 people you needed to get it done. Like, no, I'll do it, and paid off.
No, man, it definitely has like leaps and bounds. And because when did you switch over from more design into more narrative design? Like, because how long are you working as like a game level designer then?
So I've worked on Marvel's Avengers professionally, game designer for 2 years on sort of AAA, and before that, it was like half a year of level design at an internship. So like 2.5 years of just design stuff. But the thing is, like I never quit doing game design, even if I was a narrative designer. I'd still be like working on missions and other levels and making my own sort of like segments of a level if I need be. So I'm still doing it, mate. I'm still doing all the things.
I know, mate. I'm just intimidated, mate. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to keep you in a box so you don't come after my job.
Yeah, that's what the schools tell you. Like you got to specialize, but that's not. I've not found that to be true. I think generalists are like very valued in companies because they are sort of like they can communicate with multiple disciplines and understand needs, and it's like, oh, maybe we shouldn't ask for that because I know what it's going to take, or like maybe we should because that's easy, we can just do that.
Yeah, and I think especially like with the tools, man, like being able to understand certain things and being able to like you just mentioned, then go off and actually just do it, actually create it and go ahead with it. I think that's just so important for it because it's our industry is an industry based on what was it show don't tell, and I think that's a really positive skill for others to have.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask then, mate, being I know, like you said, you're more of a generalist, but what would you suggest for people who are trying to look into, say, getting the role of a narrative designer? Like, what does that kind of portfolio or examples of work look like in your mind, mate?
Yeah, it's fun because there are a lot of narrative design trying to break in, right? Because it's sort of like there's those, this is general consensus of like everyone can be a writer, right? It's not exclusive to our industry. Like I'm sure it's the same for Hollywood or writing novels as well. But in our case, since we are an interactive medium, having anything playable that people can just play and see is always the best, because it shows you that yes, you can write and you sort of like understand the language of video games, right? Because it's very different writing a script for a video game as opposed to like a movie, especially because video games are non-linear, so you can experience most things like in any order. So if you can show that it's like you can sort of like you yourself can design an area or a quest. The number one thing I was like, yeah, just make a mod. Just make a mod. It's easiest because you can see how things are made, and you don't have to make an entire game in Unreal or Unity to pull it up. Right? Like there's some other tools like Twine, and it's a lot of just narrative focused text based kind of stuff. And I think that if you do know that, it's pretty good. But I would also recommend people to have a technical, because it will give you a big edge over everyone else who isn't skilled in that regard. It was a question I had recently answered, like at a talk that I did.
Oh, okay.
People ask it a lot. Like, what's a good portfolio look like? Yeah, do gamey stuff. Make it very gamey. If you can make a quest in Skyrim, you're way ahead of a lot of your peers or like aspiring developers.
I think that's such a good one. I think actually the RPG Maker is such a good throwback. Back when I did my test for CD Projekt, I did like that in RPG.
Oh, really? You did RPG Maker? Oh my god, that's so cool. Yeah. How they receive that?
Well, because that was there was a mix up in my application because I meant to apply for Cyberpunk, but I got put through to the Gwent team.
Oh wow!
So I didn't realize at the time, so I had to do 2 tests. But like the mistake I made for it, I will say, is like I think they liked it overall. I think I kept the big thing for me was making sure, like, even if it was in that kind of 2D sprites, that it felt like there was a world filled with choices, and like there was branching narratives, right? Like you were going to, essentially you were exploring some woods looking for some like traditional thing of like campfire materials, and depending which route you took, you could find you were going to get captured regardless, right? Like whether you found them all, returned to the base, people would stalk you, whether you like were ambushed. And they enjoyed that. The mistake I made was I had people play test before I sent it over to them, and everyone's like, oh, it's too easy, like, because you can make the turn-based combat.
No.
And I got it and they liked it, but they're like, oh yeah, no, I just died on like the first combat. And I was like, oh my god, like I should have just let that be as easy as possible, because you never know someone's skill set. But generally they really liked it, mate, and that was a big one, because again, I was applying for the role of a quest designer at the time.
How long ago was that?
I didn't get it. I got into level design for that, so make it that way you will. Oh, yeah. I think it was just also like once I'd switched over from Gwent to Cyberpunk, it was clear that was probably better just for both of us.
Oh, nice.
But like, yeah, man, I think it went down well, is what I'll say. And I'm not saying it's the greatest test I've ever done, but I think there's a charm to it, right? Like there is some elements that show, again, quest design, not necessarily level design, but
they go hand in hand. They go hand in hand.
Yeah,
it depends where you put the emphasis, right?
That's it.
Do you want to do talking and you would have an intricate thing, or you're like, oh yeah, you just go to a bunch of dungeons and then from that emerges. That's the quest. The dungeon is the quest, right?
Yeah,
It's all tied together, man.
that's the
We're all
beauty,
in the
man.
same boat. Like you and me, RPG Maker. Let's go.
I think like you bringing that up, mate, is just a great example of, again, something that may not have the pizzazz or the snazzy look of something built in a 3D engine, but still can just deliver so much for those who are using it right, and just give you a much better view of it, right? And I think that's a big element.
Yeah, no. At the end of the day, it's just all about making something memorable, right? You gotta give people a good time. Could be text based, could be anything, but
yeah, man.
yeah.
No, I agree. It's funny because that God of War level I'm working with a friend to help write some of the dialogues.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and because comes from more of a script background.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's me trying to tell him, I was like, dude, we don't have like a long time for this kind of monologue here. We have to make this snappy as the players move.
Less dialogue is better dialogue.
Yeah.
It's best dialogue. Is what I've heard, like learned through experience. Like,
Yeah.
it's very like, oh, I'm gonna do a monologue. No, you don't have the time.
Yeah. And the player's already left the location.
They don't care. It's like no, but that's a very real problem. At a certain point amount of dialogue, people are not gonna listen. They're gonna tune out, and everything you do doesn't matter at that point.
Yeah.
It's like, why don't I understand what's going on in my level? It's because you tuned out like 5 minutes ago when we were explaining.
No,
and that's why you have like on-screen objective text and all other kind of hand-holdy stuff nowadays, because we don't trust people to know what's going on anymore.
I was going to ask, like, with that, how do you think that? Because you mentioned there a few times about less text is generally better, but how are you finding like examples of games giving good exposition for it? Like, how are you finding any good examples for that?
Well, good question. It's been a while since I played. when was the last time I played a good game with good exposition? Well, good narrative is visible, right? As long as you don't, it doesn't bother you. That's typically tends to be good.
Yeah.
Because the worst thing, and I've seen a lot of things pop up over the past year, is when games annoy you in terms of writing, because then you've lost the player. Like, it doesn't really matter if you still write. It's like, oh, another dramatic character having a monologue about how their doggy was lost and died or something. Like, oh god,
dude, yeah. Like, we were talking off air, but I was just saying how I've been watching some more Demon Slayer, and I will say one of the things that's just boring me to death is, bar like one character now, like every one of them has got this tragic, angsty teenage.
Well, you're watching a show for teens. You're not the target, I guess. It also doesn't help that people tend to criticize anime for like their monologues, but that's mostly because it's an adaptation from like manga, which is a lot of reading and a lot of text and a lot of inner monologues, right? Time doesn't really passes differently in a comic book than it does in like an anime. So
yeah, I think it's also about like how they deliver it, right? Like, normally you insert a flashback of a character right before their either big moment of death or their big comeback moment, right? And it's just like, okay, but why is that? Why do you feel this is the important point to reveal that information versus like other points, right? Like, and I think that's part of the issue with anime. As you said, it is switching it over, but there's different ways to deliver it, right? But it seems like everyone's just like, no, we'll play it the same format that everyone does, and it keeps it very.
I wish I could do that. We could do that in video games, but it's really expensive because you can't be like before a character dies, transition to another level, load everything in, and be like, oh, remember, this is a flashback. There's probably some games that have done it, but people are gonna be like, why are you doing this? It was just such a hassle, Like, well, in Cinemax, you cut and then you move it over to another thing. Like, we have technical constraints where we have to adhere to, which also informs, the boundaries we work with.
Yeah, man.
What's our equivalent of flashbacks?
What, in terms of like a negative trope in terms of delivering narrative?
Like, just exclusively video gamey.
I think sometimes it can either depend, right? Like, you can either have it it can either be seen as like maybe a cut scene where the player like loses all control, like what you know when
Oh
you
yeah. I get like yeah when you defeat a boss and then in the in the cutscene you lose.
yeah, oh, mate, yeah. I don't get why we still do that. Why don't we just do the Dark Souls? Hey, like you lost for it.
It's expensive, man.
Well, I mean, I think it's also the fear, right? Of like, if the players feel they lost to the first boss, that I think there has been that fear that players will just walk away, and especially nowadays where people are only buying a couple of games a year, right? Like it's you don't want to
Yeah,
make
Japan
them.
doesn't care. I think they're just like they're not as. I don't think they're as concerned with
No,
user tests and playability and all the other stuff like Westerners. That's why people get mad at Elden Ring, right? It's like,
yes,
this is stupid. This is a weird thing. It's like, and then for them it's fine. Like it's a cultural thing. It's like, yeah, this we were used to this kind of level of friction, and it's part of the game. Like,
yeah. It is quite an interesting watching their whole uh, from softwares, especially in terms of like a narrative side, right? Because I think there are so many people that seem to interpret and get so much. I personally am not just one of them when I watch it because like it's
mhm.
very buried deep in item descriptions, a lot of the stuff as well. And yeah, I think for me, like many others, I buy a game to play a game, not to read, which is the risky thing.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm like the next game I'm working on is going to be more it's going to be more Dark Souls and From Software
Hmm.
in terms of because it's also like a budget thing, right? Like you
Yeah.
can't like they're saving so much money by not having a lot of exposition, a
Oh
lot
god.
of character,
Yeah.
and a lot of dialogue and a lot of it's like the typical Sony third person
Yes.
video game kind of that's expensive, man. That's a lot of work, a lot of hours. Like
Dude. Yeah.
if you don't have the capacity for it, you got to resort to different methods. And I think From Software is a company that's very smart in emphasizing their resources on content. Just pure like, oh yeah, we're
Yeah.
gonna have 30 unique bosses in our game with all movesets. Like if you look at most of our Western RPGs and stuff, like we don't really do a lot of gameplay variety like that. It's just
No.
not important.
I think also like it's interesting you mentioned that because the art of a boss battle now has changed so dramatically, especially in the West. It doesn't feel as wow as say over in something like Elden Ring and From
Yeah, they make it a
Software
playable
stuff. Like
spectacle. We try to make it sort of like
yeah,
flashy with the cutscenes and the huge and sort of like the mid
yes,
combat cutscenes where you're fighting and it transitions into like a thing where they lock and they talk
yeah,
dramatically and you switch to another different combat arena and then it continues like that, like sort of like a seamless thing. Well, um,
mm,
From Software is
yeah,
really good at
I
putting all their
agree.
points into just make it pure gameplay and we're gonna have a very extravagant, varied moveset, and when it comes
Yeah,
to like boss design, we're like, oh yeah, in this phase he does all these things, and then he gets his one more attack. It's like,
yes,
nope, just do all the things. Like, okay, there's like yeah,
yeah,
From Software that often does like the second phase or like a halfway point where everything changes, but we're more fan of like doing the gradual and sort of like evolving experience beat up beat, sort of like like a movie, right? Like if you were watching an anime episode
mm,
and sort of the cadence of those fights. That's sort of like also how we sort of model it. Cinematic is basically the emphasis where we put everything in. Uh,
agreed. I think there's especially out in America, right? You can almost tell there's a desire to be
mhm.
Hollywood. Uh, Sometimes for the pros, but also sometimes to a detriment as well. I think
Yeah,
like I'm
definitely.
not, a fan of wanting to be Hollywood. I just that's not who we are, and that's okay. Like, why do we have to be that for it? But yeah, man, I think it's such a balancing act, and I wonder from your point of view as well, mate, because we're seeing more transitions from games to films or TV shows. What do you think about that, especially like the narrative has to be told different for these different mediums?
Yeah, well, I've been on the AAA Hollywood side because I worked at Marvel's Avengers for 3 years as a
Yeah,
narrative designer. So like, yeah, I knew the the cost and the um, yeah, it was a lot. It's like it's not my personally. I wouldn't make games like that. It's not my preferred style. I'm very much more like leaning towards the RPGs and like the systemic stuff, right? Like the good old fashioned. Oh, I'm gonna walk to a guy, and you
yeah,
have a dialogue system. You have so many things you can choose if you want to. Like it's optional. Like I think it's important to realize that narrative isn't the most important thing when people play video games, right? Because even like we sell games
yeah,
mostly based on visual flair and oh, it looks cool gameplay. I'm gonna do that as opposed to like, oh, I hope, people say story is the most important thing, even like on development, and like when you ask someone in like just consumer, but it's not the most important thing. It's the first thing to get cut. It's the first
No.
thing that's going to be compromised when production schedules get heavy, and you got to save time and money. So yeah, we're cutting this part, this cutscene, and this levels, which means you have to sort of like string together something else. Like
Yeah.
it's more okay. So going back onto what is a narrative designer? A narrative designer is making sure that all the bullshit everyone wants like comes together as a cohesive whole in the end.
There's definitely some because I've definitely heard some stories where teams have brought on like a narrative designer like way late in production as well, and I'm just like, God, like how do you do that so late?
You're fine if your emphasis is pure gameplay. There are a lot of like countless puzzle games where you don't really need a narrative designer. It's pretty. It's level design is more.
Don't send yourself out of work right now.
Well, no, but I can still do game design. It's fine. Like, but
yeah,
it does feel undervalued, because I've heard some of my former colleagues like talk about how they were treated, and how people just don't listen, and it's a sad thing. We should all listen to each other, because we're all like wacky, talented creatives, and we should learn from each other, and we should help and lift each other up. But that's not always the case, especially in sort of high level AAA, where there are people with egos walking around. They like imagine pretending that games should be more like Hollywood because it lends them some sort of credit, or like validates the art form. It's like, no, you don't. We don't need it. We're perfect. Tetris is perfectly fine without a story.
Well, it's also like you look at Fortnite, man. That game is just, and even to a sense like World of Warcraft. And I know there's an argument that there is narrative in there. I'm not disputing that, but you're telling me Fortnite is like, like only there because of narrative? No, it's not even remotely there. And like World of Warcraft really perfected, in my opinion, that whole aspect of the grind and leveling up. Like the stories are cool, but most people played to get to level 60, 70, 100, whatever it is now, right? Like, and it's all, as you said, like one aspect to try hopefully help and grow with things.
And that's also the thing, right? Like it's very important to have good narrative, because it bleeds into all parts of your design. But there's going to be a large group of people who are going to skip it, and you should also accommodate for them. But also, there are people who do only play for story, because that's how they engage with the medium. But they're not. They tend not to be the majority.
No, I mean, no, I definitely don't think so as much now. Like, there's definitely a place in it. I will say I was really impressed with Overwatch when that first came out, and how they looked at the whole multiplayer style to how to inject narrative in that. I thought it was really
it's a good old Blizzard
really
DNA,
smart.
sort of like being able to take an established genre and sort of like turn it up in his head. It's like, oh yeah, this is how we should. This is how all games within this genre should be, right?
At Level Design Lobby, we believe everybody has a story to tell. Hobbyist or student, freelancer or veteran, we made it our mission to unite those who share our passion for creating and developing great games. Thanks to our generous Patreon backers, we've been able to do just that. So if you've already pledged your support, thank you. If not, you too can ensure the future of Level Design Lobby, helping us to create even more exciting content, collaborations, interviews, and much more. With awesome perks and rewards, whether you're a seasoned professional or just getting started, you're sure to find something for you. Want to share tips, tricks, and advice with passionate, like-minded developers? Our awesome community Discord has you covered. Fancy practicing your level design, creating strong portfolio content, and having fun? Then try our level design weekends. Or perhaps you want to individually discuss your work, hone your skills, or level up your career? Then consider our one-on-one mentorships. If you share our vision, then go to patreon.com/Level Design Lobby for more information and to pledge your support. Thank you.
Yeah. Really smart. Like sometimes, we just see like other developers and like, God, you guys are just so fucking smart.
Yeah, that's what most people get imposter syndrome from, I guess. I don't know. I haven't had most of the trouble. I think maybe more as a narrative designer, I'm like a little bit more insecure about my work. Like me as a game designer, I'm like pretty good at making games. Can't stop me. What are you talking? You don't know what you're talking about. But yeah, I guess it's because there's a lot. Because game design can be good or bad, right? Like it's It's very if you have, there's a goal that you can have, and that if you reach that goal, if it all works as intended, you did a good job. Narrative design is all subjective, so even if you wrote the best thing you ever had, like from the heart, about like real experiences, there's always going to be one of the two guys who are like, that's cringe, dude, that's stupid. So in the case of narrative design, just be truthful to yourself and like to others, and hopefully you'll create something that'll resonate with people.
I think it's also like an interesting, because you say about game design, like you can prototype something relatively quick, right, to see if it worked or doesn't for the desired outcome. But narrative, as you said, like you might give someone a script and you're like, oh, okay, but you can't necessarily see it until more of the game's fleshed out at times. And that, can really, it's a bit just more of a slower process, and also more eye-opening at each stage, because it does change the perception of it, right?
Yeah, that's the fun part about sort of like seeing stuff like narrative and dialogue and everything that we know of as narrative, experience as narrative in games. Sort of like a lot of the time during production, it's not there. And even when it is, like placeholder VO, people are probably not sold on it until like a voice actor comes in and it's like, oh my God. Because voice actors are the best, man. Like they can make anything sound good. Like even lines where I was like, "It's stupid," they were like, "Wow, they delivered that perfectly."
Yeah, I was gonna say, have you worked much with voice actors in
Not
studios
me,
then, mate?
Because I just wrote it. But like it was an American crew sort of like recording everything, so I wasn't involved in that process. But only for like modding, I did. It's like amateur voice acting. Stuff like that. But I tend to be sort of like hands off in terms of like voice direction, and like I often have a dedicated voice director because I don't want to be bothered to do that as well. Like, it's a lot. I already have a lot of stuff on my plate. To do a little bit less is fine. Like I trust others to do an equal or better job than I do, because I tend the best things that I work on is always like it's always a team effort.
Yeah, mate, no, I completely agree. I think that's and as you said, like with time as well, like it's so hard to give everything your full attention or everything if you're just constantly pulled in too many different directions.
Yeah, you got to pick your battles, especially on the bigger and long projects, especially because burnout is real, and that's another game dev conversation talk you can have.
Yeah, man, I think it's strange as well, because obviously games are becoming more expensive to make. The obviously duration to complete them's very much getting longer. I think for everyone working on a game, like I remember when it was like, oh yeah, it's like 3 years to make a game. It feels like it's 5 is the average now.
Yeah, everything gets bigger because we have to, right? You have to keep up. But
yeah, I wonder though if bigger doesn't always mean better, right? And I think that's something that I feel like we're getting lost in at times. But again, it's easy to say that from the sideline versus funding something to actually
but also most important to remember is that you're not competing against like games that started when they launched, right? You're competing against established franchises that have been working and churning out things for like decades, or like 5 years, right? Like if you were to release an Overwatch competitor right now, it'd be like, yeah, you'd be competing against Overwatch that with 5 years progress ahead. So right, you have to something viable that goes against that, right? Or like you have to take it up against a studio who has a similar project like yours have, but they have 20 years of making RPG experience behind their bag and an engine that can handle everything they need, and you might not need that. You don't have it, and then you have to spend time and money and to getting up to that level. But that could be years essentially.
Yeah, no, it's a real, how do I say, like, yeah, it's just a real challenge figuring it all out for that. And yeah, man. But I just seen the time, mate. So is there anything else you want to share before we wrap up?
I don't have anything to
the
sell
episode,
yet.
buddy?
Next year I'll start selling stuff. I'm good now. Follow me on social media platforms.
We'll bring it on then. Yeah, do you want to give a shout out to your social media? I'll put them in the description.
My Twitter and my Blue Sky or anything that exists for now, I hope, at the time of this podcast releases. I don't know. It's the stage of social media, man. My TikToks, my Instagram. My Instagram is Warhammer. So if you like Warhammer, look at my Instagram.
There we go. Well, that, mate. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show, man. I really do appreciate it. And yeah, man, pleasure working with you. And well, that doesn't end after
We'll have
this
a
podcast
friendship
ends,
for years.
so we'll keep
I'm sure
going.
we'll keep working together.
That's it.
It's all good, man.
That's it, man. All right. Well, if you want to reach out to me, you can so on Twitter at MaxPairs. You want to email into the show with any questions, you can do so at leveldesignlobby@gmail.com. Thank you all for listening. Take care, and we'll catch you all next time.